On a narrow Czech border ridge overlooking a dense, dark forest defile in May 1945, cold air settles over a stationary column of armor. Sergeant Bill Harris, 26 years old, sits atop the hatch of his M4 Sherman tank, holding a battered pair of M13 6x30 tank binoculars against his brow. Down the line, an impatient staff aide rushes up to the command cupola, shouting orders for the column to immediately push forward down the exposed road into the valley below. Harris does not turn his head, nor does he start his engine. Instead, he speaks with flat, unyielding clarity, stating that the tree line is crawling with Panzerfaust teams, and without infantry screening the route, 4 tanks will burn in 5 minutes. Across the gravel path, General George S. Patton Jr. stands beside his command car, his hands resting on his hips as every officer present freezes in place. The staff aide looks around in disbelief, waiting for the inevitable explosion of fury for a sergeant. Countermanding an order in front of an army commander, Patton turns his head slowly toward the crest, eyes fixing on the young tank commander who has just brought an entire armored strike to a complete standstill. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether an entire platoon was about to be destroyed or saved. And the answer was not what anyone on that ridge was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it cost Sergeant Bill Harris to hold that heavy tank at a complete standstill on that narrow dirt trail, you need to understand what the frontline edge of an advancing armored column actually was in May 1945. It was not a tidy line on a wall map in a command trailer miles behind the front. It was a loud, smelling, terrifying reality of hot iron, blue diesel exhaust, and raw friction. A single road cut into a dense forest defile was a fatal bottleneck. The armor moved forward because stopping meant static exposure, and static exposure brought artillery brackets. The men inside those 30-ton steel hulls lived by a single operational logic, which was to keep the tracks turning and clear the choke points before the enemy could zero in his guns. When an order came down from staff to clear a pass, you did not debate the topography. You dropped the clutch and pushed the metal forward. The unwritten rules of that momentum were absolute, especially when high-ranking staff officers were standing on the shoulders of the road, watching the timeline tick away. For a junior non-commissioned officer to countermand a direct movement order was not just an infraction of military protocol. It was considered a failure of nerve, an act of defiance that risked breaking the forward drive of an entire battle group. The invisible calculation that every other crew commander in that line performed was simple and brutal. They saw the dark, heavy pine trees. They recognized the high probability of hidden anti-tank weapons lurking in the thick underbrush. But they also calculated the career-ending cost of raising a voice against an eager young captain backed by 3 stars. Every other sergeant in those turrets swallowed his instinct, tightened his jaw, and waited for the order to move, choosing the danger of the road over the immediate hammer of the high command. By the final weeks of the war, the tactical math across Central Europe had become dangerously uneven. Germany was collapsing, but the handheld anti-tank weapon known as the Panzerfaust had turned every single foot soldier into a potential tank destroyer. A cheap, disposable-shaped charge weapon carried by a teenager hidden in a hollow tree trunk could burn a $70,000 medium tank and kill 5 experienced men in a split second. The arithmetic was ruthless. Sending 4 unescorted M4 Shermans down a narrow, uncleaned forest defile meant risking 20 veteran combat aircrew against 3 or 4 hidden defenders carrying weapons that cost virtually nothing to produce. The loss of those vehicles did not just represent dead soldiers. It meant a dead stop for the main supply route behind them, blocking thousands of troops for hours. That was the exact calculation of terrain, armor, and human life that Bill Harris was looking at through his binoculars when he refused to turn his engine. And that was the frozen dirt road he brought to a dead stop. Picture the scene on that narrow mountain road. 34 tanks and armored half-tracks sit idling bumper to bumper in the damp morning mist. The temperature hangs just above freezing. Diesel fumes cling heavy to the damp earth, mixing with the sharp scent of wet pine needles and crushed shale. Inside those cramped iron turrets, men press their goggles against their eyes, trying to peer through the thick timber ahead. Their hands are locked tight around hot thermos cups or sticky control handles. Nobody is talking over the intercom system. Every radio frequency is quiet, filled only with the faint hiss of static and the low, heavy throbbing of high horsepower engines waiting for the signal to roll. The silence across the entire column is heavy and absolute. The surrounding officers are not looking at the road ahead. They are staring at the back of the sergeant sitting motionless on his hatch. They are staring at the 3 silver stars glistening on the collar of the officer standing 5 feet from his tracks. They all know the math of standard discipline. They know what happens when a non-commissioned officer publicly checks the forward drive of a battle group in front of the army commander. Stay with me, because what happened next on that ridge is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive are consistent in shape. General George S. Patton Jr. purloined his field glasses, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. Not the way a general looks at an act of outright insubordination, not the way a man looks at an interruption that has irritated him. He looked at Sergeant Bill Harris the way he looked at terrain, reading the tactical reality written across the young non-commissioned officer's face. The air on the ridge turned brittle. Beside the command vehicle, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams watched the 3-star general step forward onto the dirt path. Abrams knew the weight of every tank in the 37th Armored Battalion, and he knew the temper of his commander, but Patton did not roar. He did not strip the sergeant of his rank or demand that the column force its way down the throat of the defile. Instead, Patton raised his hand toward the tree line. His eyes sweeping the silent forest one last time, he gave a brief, singular nod toward Harris atop the turret. Then, turning on his heel, he gave a crisp instruction to his senior officers, directing the trailing infantry company to immediately deploy forward and screen the woods. Without another word, Patton walked back to his command car, climbed into the passenger seat, and left the hill. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams described that sudden departure with one word: deliberate. See, what most folks don't realize is that an effective army relies on a precise balance between strict chain-of-command discipline and raw battlefield reality. A general sitting in a staff car sees lines on a map, operational timetables, and strategic objectives, but a tank commander sitting in an open hatch sees the immediate geometry of fire. He hears the wind through the pines and smells the silent trap waiting in the brush. Patton understood that true leadership is not about enforcing blind obedience over physical facts. When a veteran sergeant who has survived months of armored warfare tells you a tree line is crawling with anti-tank weapons, he is not offering an opinion or displaying hesitation. He is supplying vital reconnaissance that no map overlay can provide. To overrule that sergeant in order to preserve the momentum of an order would have been an act of vanity, a sacrifice of blood for the sake of appearances. Patton recognized that Harris's refusal was born out of absolute tactical competence, a willingness to risk his own career in order to preserve the combat power of his platoon. By stepping back and letting the infantry clear the defile, Patton validated the sergeant's eye, choosing to lose 15 minutes of operational time rather than 4 medium tanks and 20 experienced soldiers in an avoidable ambush. Before the war, Bill Harris was not a soldier trained for grand tactical maneuvers. He was a 26-year-old machinist's mate from a working-class neighborhood in Dallas, Texas. His father was an ironworker, a quiet, methodical man who spent 30 years high above the street, driving hot rivets into structural steel. From his father, Harris learned a single foundational rule: you never trust a beam until you have inspected the weld yourself. In 1942, when Harris enlisted, he brought that exact mechanical realism to the 761st Tank Battalion. He was not a romantic, and he was not a reckless man. He was the kind of soldier who looked at a map and saw the physical weight of iron, coal, and human bodies moving across terrain. Before shipping overseas, Harris spent his evenings writing long letters to a young woman named Clara back in Dallas, who worked as a clerk at a local hardware store. In every letter, he described his plans for after the victory. He did not dream of military glory or a permanent commission. He wanted to return home, open a small precision machine shop on the north side of town, and spend his life working with his hands. That practical vision kept him grounded through every brutal engagement across Western Europe. When Harris eventually learned what had happened behind his vehicle after General Patton returned to his car, his reaction was completely characteristically flat. He did not brag to his crew, nor did he boast about standing his ground against a 3-star general. Instead, he simply adjusted his cap, turned back to his gunner, and asked if the infantry had finished clearing the left side of the tree line so they could finally move forward. For Harris, refusing to advance was not an act of historic defiance, it was merely a basic safety check. No different than inspecting a steel weld before putting weight on a bridge. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who observed the entire standoff from his command hatch, survived the war to become one of the most distinguished armored commanders in American military history. Decades later, Abrams would often recall that frozen morning on the Czech border. He noted that the decision made on that ridge saved an entire platoon from immediate destruction, allowing the 37th Tank Battalion to secure the valley without losing a single vehicle. Abrams later served as Chief of Staff of the United States Army, but he always maintained that the moment General Patton left the hill was one of the purest demonstrations of tactical wisdom he ever witnessed. As for the narrow forest defile, the infantry screen moved in, routed out 6 hidden anti-tank teams, and cleared the pass within 45 minutes. The column rolled forward, the heavy Sherman tanks grinding past the pine trees into the valley below. In Harris's hands, the battered pair of M13 6x30 binoculars rested against his chest, their scuffed metal frames cool against his worn field jacket. Was Patton right to accept the correction and leave the hill without enforcing his aide's movement order? Some would say that allowing a non-commissioned officer to countermand an operational advance in full view of an entire column undermines the strict discipline and absolute authority necessary to command an army in battle. They would argue that once a commander hesitates, the momentum of the strike is lost, and the chain of command begins to fracture. Others would say exactly the opposite, arguing that true leadership lies in recognizing superior tactical awareness on the ground, and that sacrificing men and armor simply to preserve the appearance of rank is an act of foolish vanity. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.